Chapter 71. Swish! Ungom retrieved his sword. Drops of sweat ran down his forehead. A good sword art. There was definitely something different about the Seven Sages' sword that they had learned from Mount Hua and what he was following now. It cannot be called the best, but the sword was still amazing. It would take a heavy investment of time to truly understand and master this sword art. However, even with his shallow achievements, Ungom already understood that this Seven Sages' sword was a level higher than what they were currently taught. If this sword can be taught properly, Mount Hua will become stronger. The present disciples will become stronger, and the future generations will be even more powerful. Just thinking about it made Ungom smile. Ungom quickly rubbed his smile away. This is quite difficult. He was still a teacher, which meant he had to be strict with his disciples. Lately, though, he just couldn't stop smiling. Until now, the experiences that third-class disciples have shared could not simply be summed up as mere hardships. Ever since they entered Mount Hua until now, there has been nothing but struggle and suffering. Still, they devoted their youth to Mount Hua. With the collapsing sect on their shoulders, they constantly overcame the hardships and persevered through suffering. After such a long period of darkness, they were only now seeing the light. We aren't fully out of trouble yet. Although Ungom could finally see the light at the end of the long tunnel, he was all too aware that there was still a long way to go. Even so, he couldn't erase the smile on his face. It was all thanks to the third-class disciples who started to grow strangely quick in recent times. The elders and the sect leader seemed to find the greatest joy in the fact that Mount Hua was financially stable and had found its lost martial arts. But it was different for Ungom. As the head of the White Plum Blossom boarding house, the growth of his disciples was what brought him the most satisfaction. They're different from us. The second-class disciples tried their best, but unfortunately, Mount Hua didn't have an appropriate environment to train or improve. To be honest, they didn't have much passion for martial arts either, but the third-class disciples are more passionately devoted to their personal training than any of the Mount Hua's previous disciples. Ungom smiled, put the sword on his waist, and left the training hall with light steps. It was time to train the children. His imagination was overflowing with pleasant thoughts. Mount Hua's desperate situation had been resolved. With their recovered martial arts and the third-class disciples showing a vigorous desire to grow their martial talents, it seemed that the hour of Mount Hua's resurrection was growing near. And the main characters of that revival will be the third-class disciples. I'll have to work harder for that to happen. How could he call himself their mentor if he couldn't even lead his students who were working hard by themselves? Ungom turned and entered the disciples' training hall before shouting with a flustered face. Okay, let's do well today too. What is this? Fuck! Ungom stepped back in shock. What was in front of his eyes could only be described as pure chaos. Arm! My arm! Back! My back is down! Broken! Save me! Save me! Unknowingly, Ungom rubbed his eyes. What had happened in this training hall? Suddenly, Ungom felt that his dreams of teaching Mount Hua's future leaders had been set ablaze and were crashing down around him. All the third-class disciples were lying on the floor, groaning while holding their wooden swords, their shoulders trembling and mouths drooling. What the hell happened? At that moment, a sound erupted from somewhere nearby. Ungom turned his head and saw Jogul's figure using his wooden sword with his shirt off. Jogul. Sweat was pouring down his body like rain. Each time the sword was swung, sweat scattered and a hot breath could be seen exhaling from his mouth. Blazing red eyes, full of focus, and trembling shoulders told the story of a boy pushing himself past his limits. Even Ungom felt his entire body tremble at the sight. Okay, one more! At those words, Ungom's eyes turned. What is with him? Next to Jogul, Chongmyung was slowly holding his sword. Unlike Jogul, who was sweating profusely, Chongmyung seemed rather refreshed. His hair was neat, and not even a single strand stood out of place. He wielded his sword smoothly in a relaxed fashion, unlike the Sahyungs scattered around on the verge of death. Just swinging your sword isn't enough. If you're going to swing once, imagine squeezing out all your strength, from the tip of your toes to your head and through your sword. Once more! What was the situation? Wasn't Chongmyung the youngest of the third-class disciples? So why is he teaching Jogul? However, everything Chongmyung said was correct. Okay, one more. In the end, Jogul, who couldn't stand it, fell to the floor. Seeing that, Chongmyung clicked his tongue. You people are seriously weak. Chongmyung sighed deeply. You're just overworking your body. You aren't a cow. Use that head of yours. Use your brain. Think about how to swing the sword so that you can utilize all the strength in your body and then swing it. What? Eungum's eyes trembled. The other elders might be unaware, but Eungum knew that Chongmyung could control the third-class disciples to some extent. It may be difficult to understand, but weren't there always talented people whose skills transcended their age? However, what Chongmyung was discussing now wasn't something that could be waved off as simple talent or ability. Does this mean that he has a higher understanding of the martial arts? The more he observed this kid, the more amazed he felt. Eungum, suddenly awoken from his thoughts, shook his head. This wasn't the time for such things. What is this? Chongmyung shook his head when Eungum asked. Oh my, teacher! Chongmyung quickly ran up to Eungum. How was last night? Seeing him act like a child, the third-class disciples gritted their teeth. That sly son of a bitch! If he was in the Imperial Palace, there would have been books written positively about him. He's a demon with no spine, constantly changing sides. Why wouldn't they be upset? Chongmyung was the youngest and should have shown respect to them as his Sahyungs, but he only showed respect to Eungum and the other elders. In particular, Jogul and Yunjung, who were the biggest victims, dejectedly looked at Chongmyung with narrowed eyes. What happened here? We were training. Training? This is training? No, it certainly was training. Eungum witnessed Jogul swinging the sword with his own two eyes, but the result was... Teacher! Too difficult. I might die. The third-class disciples looked at Eungum like puppies who found their master. Without realizing it, Eungum ended up raising his voice upon seeing their expression. Training is a part of the process to develop the body and mind. Don't you know that too much training is poisonous? And you... I know, teacher. Huh? Eungum's eyes narrowed as Chongmyung's words interrupted his lecture. Did this mean that he had a proper response to give in this situation? But this training wasn't started by me. The Sahyungs, who didn't want to experience disgrace in the Mount Hua and Jungnam Sect conference, have... conference? Right. The conference was approaching soon. That was true. The Sahyungs were upset with the humiliation they faced last time. Upset? Eungum slowly turned his head and looked at the third-class disciples. The children were desperately waving their hands behind Chongmyung. Seeing their reaction, Eungum said, looking at the children, that doesn't seem to be the case. What? Is that possible? Sasuk, how could one be proud to declare themselves as a disciple of Mount Hua if they've suffered defeat at the hands of those Jongnam bastards? He was right. We can lose once, but losing twice is unforgivable. A disciple of the great Mount Hua should never accept such results. Right. Confusion beset Eungum as he began to nod his head. There were only two things he valued most in the world. One was the pride of Mount Hua, and the other was to raise the disciples correctly. Now, it seemed that both of his values had turned their blades towards one another and conflicted. Chongmyung, who read the confusion in Eungum's eyes, approached and whispered, Sasuk, think about it. The best way to raise Mount Hua's honor is to strengthen the Sahyungs and break apart those Jungnam Sect bastards, right? That... The elders will also appreciate and praise Sasuk's hard work. The sly bastard. Eungom wasn't oblivious. He could tell that Chongmyung was manipulating him. But such sweetly honeyed words were too enticing for Eungom to ignore. He wasn't interested in receiving praises for his efforts, but to beat down the Jeongnam sect was. Do you think it's possible? Unknowingly, Eungom had asked for Chongmyung's opinion. Hearing that, Chongmyung smiled. I am Chongmyung. Eungom looked at Chongmyung and coughed. Looking back, it was none other than Chongmyung who had changed these children. Weren't these children training because of Chongmyung? Perhaps this process was more necessary than learning a new sword art. No matter how lucky he was, it was impossible to teach that new sword technique in a short period and overcome the Jeongnam sect. Just once more, Eungom looked at everyone and opened his mouth to speak. Disciples, listen to me. Yes, Sasuk. The third-class disciples set their full attention on Eungom, desperately pleading with their tired eyes, their last hope. There's a limit to how proud I can be that you are showing such enthusiasm in your training. After all, it is my responsibility to be the one who guides you all. However, it wouldn't be right for me to disturb your ambitions when you're voluntarily training so vigorously. What is this? Oh, is that the sound of hope crashing into pieces? Until the conference, I will leave the training to you all. In the meantime, you don't have to come to the training hall and are free to train anywhere. However, you must be careful not to hurt yourselves. Master, this isn't right. Sasuk! You may all continue now. Eungom turned his body away. Some of the third-class disciples unwittingly stretched out their hands to grab hold of their fading hope. But upon seeing the look in Chongmyung's eyes, they quickly pulled back. Eventually, Eungom walked away and Chongmyung turned his body and twisted his head toward the abandoned disciples. So who was the one that told Sasuk that you were having a hard time? Say it quickly. The eyes of the third-class disciples were dyed with despair as they watched Chongmyung pull out the wooden sword on his waist.